Welcome to this Killick Explains Finance video. This week, fairly topical, fairly timely, let's take a look at what you need to know about an adult ISA before the 5th of April. Now I'm going to focus on the adult ISA. There are other ISAs and I'll give you an email address at the end if you want to find out more about those. So here we go. What do we got here? Background would be 5th of April marks the end of the tax year 2019-2020. So in case you hadn't realised, not long left to get organised in terms of tax effective savings vehicles before the end of the tax year. ISAs in particular work on a use it or lose it basis. You need to make a decision. If you don't use this year's ISA allowance, you can't sort of backdate it for next year, as it were. And so here's a quick reminder about the key features and a few quirks that sometimes people miss when they read about these things in the media. So the basic deal is what? In a nutshell, every UK adult can invest up to £20,000 into an ISA. I won't go into the definition of UK adult, but most people watching this video will probably qualify. And it's £20,000 per person per year. Now that can change, but at the moment that's the limit. This can be directed into a wide range of investments or left in cash. I'll come back to that in a moment. So remember, the ISA itself is just a shelter that sits over the top of investments that you select within that shelter. And all subsequent income received or capital gains made are tax-free. So once investments or cash are parked inside this umbrella, if you like, sheltered by the tax-efficient ISA wrapping, then subsequent tax is minimised on those investments. Be careful if you make a withdrawal, that changes things, but if you leave them inside the wrapper, it's pretty tax effective. Now, what can you include? Let's go through a few basic points first of all. So, within the wrapper, remember an ISA is just a wrapper. You've still got to make a selection of things to go in it. Cash is one option, but we know that interest rates are pretty low at the moment. So arguably not a huge case for putting cash inside an ISA wrapper. I mean, you're not saving yourself a lot of money because the interest you're earning is probably small. Many shares, including AIM shares and bonds, well, that could be a little bit more interesting over the long term. Shares have proven their worth, if you like, historically, in terms of generating inflation-beating returns, and then funds as well. So you can pop a wide range of collective investment vehicles, as they're known, inside an ISA. So lots of choice. Now, the tax effect is what? Well, basically, why are you using an ISA? What's the point of this individual savings account shelter? Well, there is no upfront tax relief. So unlike a pension, there's no kicker. There's no basic rate contribution from the government. A pound in is a pound invested. Then you get tax-free growth within the wrapper, so any income that pound generates is received income tax-free, and any capital gains you make are capital gains tax-free, and there's no tax paid on withdrawals. So at any point you can change your mind and pull your money out. Just be careful if you do that for reasons I'll be mentioning in a moment. Now, the power of compounding. There's another tax effect that I haven't really covered, and that's what does tax-free growth do for you, if you like, inside the wrapper. So let's put an axis up. Now, I've made an assumption you can afford to invest £500 monthly. Where would you be after 20 years? Now, it's not the amount that's important. You might be thinking, I haven't got £500 a month to invest in an ISA. Well, that's fine. It's the principle of what could happen. Now, at the bottom, I've assumed growth rates. So I'm presumably assuming, especially with 5% and 8%, you'd be in some sort of equity base here within the ISA wrapper. You're not going to get those rates on cash, let's face it, and these are assumed rates. Now, last year, the S&P 500 in the US managed 30%. Crazy stuff. But let's be a lot more conservative than that and assume 2, 5 as a kind of possible rate, 8 as a punchy rate, because remember, we're looking over the long term here. Now, the green bars pop up to show the amount you've contributed based on the assumption up here. So it's the same amount, no matter what growth rate you assume. And then the pink is the potential tax-free added growth on top, before charges, I should stress. Now, the point is not to try and squint at this and look at the numbers, which are important and quite impressive. You could have those amounts at the end of 20 years, if you like. The important thing is just to note that the pink bit, based on whatever contribution you make, is where you're earning the tax-free growth. So here's the point, is that ISAs do offer that ability to compound tax effectively over long periods. And that's really where they add their value, if you like. They're also quite flexible. quite flexible. So what do I mean by that? The investment mix can be changed. So one year you might be 20% cash, 80% equities for argument's sake. Another year you might decide to change that around. What you don't want to do is sit in cash for too long. The provider can be switched too. So if you feel you're not getting great performance from your current ISA provider, there is a way of transferring what's in the ISA with them to somebody else. Be careful, the word transfer should not be confused with the word withdrawal. Withdrawals are also possible. That's where you actually pull money out, you don't put it back in, you don't transfer it to another provider. That ends any future tax relief on the amount withdrawn. And then a few quirks, things you hear about less often but which are nonetheless important. So, number one, withdrawals will retain their tax relief if you reinvest within the same tax year. So that's worth bearing in mind. That's an exception to the principle that says if you take money out of an ISA, you then lose future tax benefits on it. You can keep the historic ones, but you lose future tax benefits. ISAs are subject to IHT. There's another consideration. If you are an older investor, if basically you've stopped working, for example, you need to think about how you use up your assets within tax-effective shelters. And some people tend to spend what's in ISAs first before pensions because pensions are technically not subject to IHT. There is an exception if you're a surviving spouse. There is an additional permitted transfer, as it's called, which is a way to basically preserve the tax benefits accrued by your spouse before they died. I won't say any more about that one, but it is an exception to the idea that otherwise an ISA is part of a death estate and hit for inheritance tax. And finally, if a child is aged between 16 and 18, technically they can actually open two accounts. They could open a cash adult ISA, stress cash before they're 18, and they could have a junior ISA in the same tax year. Now, I'm not going to mention junior ISAs in any more detail here, but that's a way to tuck away money on a similar basis to an adult ISA for somebody before they turn 18. Well, what's the case against? So, is it all plain sailing with ISAs? No, you do need to have a think about this. So, the dividend allowance still exists. So people thinking, isn't there a way you can get dividend income tax-free anyway? Yes, there is, but it's coming down, it's being reduced, and who knows what will happen next. So it was $5,000 a year. Now it's $2,000 a year. There's no guarantee the government will maintain it, that's the point. You do have an annual capital gains tax allowance of £12,000, 2019-20, but that's across all your assets, basically. So for some people it won't be enough, and using it does require you to liquidate assets, which is not convenient in all cases. So it's not always easy to use, and it may not be enough in some cases. Interest on cash is covered by a personal savings allowance, depending on what sort of taxpayer you are. That affects the amount of that allowance. Okay, and ISAs do carry a cost, but I've already suggested that perhaps putting cash inside one of these shelters, sitting on lots of cash outside one of these shelters, not terribly sensible because it doesn't preserve its purchasing power over time. By all means, put a bit in there while you're waiting to decide what to do with it, if you like, rather than not use the allowance at all. That's what some people do, but don't sit on it over the long term. So the buts, okay, and the buts come at the end, if you like. At the end of the day, the dividend allowance may disappear, the CGT allowance can be inflexible, and holding a lot of cash isn't a great idea, as I mentioned. So, what should you be doing now as we approach the end of the tax year? I would suggest check what you've invested in ISAs so far. You may have already been contributing on a monthly basis 2019-20 to see what you've got left. Ceiling is £20,000 of contributions in this tax year. Consider how much more you can and want to invest. If you haven't done anything yet, you'll need to think about how you can organise the cash potentially. It's going to go inside this tax shelter. And also think about how you want to do it. Cash versus equities versus funds versus bonds, and with whom. Editor@killick.com with questions. There's a few ISA products I haven't mentioned here. And if you want to watch more videos around tax-effective saving, killick.com/learn, and the tab is just down here.